The choir sang its last note, but one voice carried a hidden farewell. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments below. Your voice adds harmony to every case. Grateful to have you here. It was in the waning days of February, those cold, grey hours when London seems to shiver beneath its own gloom, that the peculiar business of the Choirboy's final note first reached us at Baker Street. The fire burned low, casting a flickering light on the haphazard chaos of Holmes's corner. Monographs on tobacco ash and medieval poisons littered the armchair beside him, and a map of southern Hampshire had been pinned to the wall with what I can only describe as surgical precision. Outside, the wind carried a melody, thin and discordant, from the direction of Soho, but Holmes paid it no mind. He was stretched languidly across the divan, his long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if the plaster itself concealed the secrets of the world. I'd just returned from tending to a feverish patient in Bloomsbury, and was unwinding with the evening paper when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor with unusual solemnity. "He wouldn't give a name," she said, "but he carries himself like a man who's never been refused entry in his life." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Show him in." Moments later, a tall man with sharp features and the unmistakable bearing of a churchman entered our sitting room. He was pale, his dark cloak dusted with sleet, and he clutched a narrow velvet cap in hands that trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, inclining his head, "I am the Reverend Gideon Greaves, Master of Music at St. Anselm's Chapel. I've come on a matter of some urgency, and even greater confusion." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Pray, begin with the confusion. It is invariably the more instructive part." Reverend Greaves sat, his eyes flicking uneasily from Holmes to myself. Yesterday morning, one of our choristers, Master Peter Willoughby, aged 12, was found dead in the chapel's antechamber, slumped beside the organ. At first, the constable suggested he'd fallen and struck his head, but there was no sign of trauma, no blood, no evidence of a seizure. And yet, he paused, voice quivering. He was clutching a single page of sheet music, a hymn I did not recognize, one he could not possibly have composed. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A hymn, you say?" "Yes, written in an unfamiliar hand, in what appears to be red ink. It bore no title, only the notation of a single vocal line, ending abruptly on a dissonant chord." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. "I brought it with me." Holmes took the page reverently, examining it beneath the gaslight with a glint of anticipation. His gaze moved across the bars, lips moving silently. "Unfinished," he murmured. "Deliberately, I think. Tell me, Reverend, was the lad particularly musical?" "Prodigiously so," Greaves replied. "A rare boy soprano. He'd been due to perform a solo at the Queen's Hall next month. It would have launched his future. But now," he faltered, "forgive me, I fear I'm making a muddle of this." "Not at all," said Holmes briskly. "You said there was no injury?" "None that we could see. The physician declared the cause of death unknown. His heart had simply stopped." At this, Holmes's brows drew together. He turned to me. "Watson, what ailments might fell a healthy boy in seconds, leaving no mark? Aneurysm, perhaps, or poisoning, some cardiac defect, but without an autopsy." "The boy's family refused it," said Greaves softly. "They are quite devout. They see his death as an act of God." "God may act," said Holmes, "but so do men. And men, I find, leave traces." He rose and paced to the window, peering out into the fog. "You've brought us an enigma, Reverend, one wrapped in silence, red ink and music." He turned. "Tell me, who would stand to gain from the death of a 12-year-old chorister?" Greaves looked taken aback. "Gain? Mr. Holmes, this was a child." "All the more reason to ask," Holmes replied. Children are often witnesses, Reverend, and a song, like a confession, may carry meanings beyond the notes. There was a pause. Then Holmes clapped his hands together. "Watson, pack your bag. We leave for St. Anselm's at once." I stood. "Tonight?" "Of course. The melody is unfinished, and I do not care for unresolved music." And with that, the game was once more afoot. The train to Hampshire cut through the night like a whisper through velvet. Holmes sat opposite me in our first-class carriage, the sheet music from the chapel resting on his knee. He had scarcely spoken a word since we departed Paddington. His gaze was fixed not on me, nor even on the score itself, but on some interior horizon known only to him. Every so often, his slender fingers would move through the air, silently mimicking the act of conducting. I let the silence stretch. I had traveled enough with Sherlock Holmes to know better than to interrupt his thoughts prematurely. Instead, I watched the shifting countryside beyond the window, the flickering lamplight catching hints of snow still clinging to the hedgerows. At last, Holmes stirred. "Watson, how many hymns do you suppose have ever ended on a diminished chord?" I blinked. "Few, I imagine. It leaves the ear unresolved, almost unnerved." "Precisely. Music, like logic, demands resolution, for a hymn to end as this one does. On a half-finished phrase, a chord suggestive of something sinister, it is not just unconventional. It is intentional. A message, perhaps. Or a signal. A signal to whom? That, my dear fellow, is what we are about to determine." We arrived at the village of St. Anselm's just after midnight, our footsteps crunching on frost-rimed cobbles as we crossed the narrow green that fronted the chapel. A squat building of early Gothic style, its dark silhouette loomed against the starlit sky. Lights burned faintly in the rectory next door, and it was there that Reverend Greaves had arranged our lodgings for the night. He met us at the door in a wool dressing-gown and thick slippers, apologizing profusely for the hour. "I've arranged for you to examine the chapel tonight, if you so wish," he said. "The constable left the door locked, but I've kept the key." Holmes nodded. The sooner, the better. Reverend Greaves led us across the short path and unlocked the great wooden doors with a heavy iron key. They swung open with a groan, releasing a breath of chill, incense-laced air that had the curious scent of wax and old stone. The nave was dark, save for moonlight pouring through the stained glass windows. St. Michael, sword drawn, loomed above us in azure and crimson glass. Holmes moved ahead of us like a shadow, his every step deliberate. He passed by the pews without a glance, heading instead to the chancel where the choir had rehearsed. It was there, in a narrow antechamber just off the main sanctuary, that Peter Willoughby's body had been found. The room was sparsely furnished, a wooden bench along one wall, a tall cabinet for vestments, and an upright piano pushed against the far corner. On the floor, the outline of the boy's body had been marked with white chalk by the constable. Holmes crouched, peering closely at the spot where the sheet music had been found. "There was no ink bottle on his person?" he asked. "None," Reverend Greaves replied. "Nor did he have pen or pencil. He shouldn't have been writing anything at all. Choir boys are not permitted to be alone in this section." Holmes nodded. "And yet he wrote this." He stood and approached the piano, lifting the lid gently. After a brief inspection, he pointed to a smudge near the keys. "Watson, your medical eye. What do you make of this?" I peered closer. There, faint against the dark wood, was a smear of reddish residue. I touched it lightly and brought my finger to my nose. "Not ink," I said. "This is blood." Reverend Greaves turned pale, but the boy had no wound. Holmes did not reply immediately. He stepped back, gazing about the small chamber. His eyes alighted on a narrow ventilation grate above the bench. "Tell me, Reverend, where does that lead?" Greaves looked up, frowning. "To the vestry above. A small passage behind the organ loft. It's hardly used. Storage, mostly. Then that is where we shall go next." We retraced our steps, ascending a narrow spiral staircase to the gallery above. The air grew colder as we climbed, and the corridor behind the organ loft was shrouded in gloom. Holmes produced a lantern from his satchel and lit it with practiced ease. The vestry was a cramped, low-ceilinged room filled with discarded robes, hymnals, and a battered chest of old choir books. Holmes swept the lantern across the floor and walls, pausing at a patch of disturbed dust beneath the vent opening. "Someone was here recently," he said. "Look, heel marks, large, adult-sized." Reverend Greaves leaned forward, but none of the staff has been up here in weeks, which suggests someone else was. Holmes moved to the chest and pried it open. Inside, amid the yellowing pages, something caught his attention. He withdrew a folded handkerchief, white linen, monogrammed with the letter D. It was stiff with dried blood. "A souvenir left in haste," Holmes murmured. He turned to Greaves. "Who at the chapel, or in its employ, has a surname beginning with D?" Greaves frowned. "There is our organist, Mr. Lionel Deeks. He has been with us nearly 6 years." "Does he often rehearse alone?" "Not often, but he holds the master key. He comes and goes at odd hours." Holmes folded the handkerchief carefully. "You said the boy was found in the morning?" "Yes, by Mr. Deeks himself. He'd arrived early to prepare for Sunday Mass." Holmes said nothing, but his expression grew colder. Back in the antechamber, Holmes examined the piano once more. He pressed a few keys softly. A haunting, minor melody filled the air, then stopped. "There is something odd here," he muttered. He leaned down, tracing the edge of the keys. Then he drew a fine tool from his coat and slid it beneath the keyboard with precision. Something clicked, and a small compartment popped open. Inside was a slender vial. Holmes held it up to the lantern. The liquid inside was clear and faintly viscous. "Watson?" I took the vial and sniffed it with caution. The scent was faintly bitter. "Digitalis," I said after a moment. "In concentrated form." Reverend Greaves looked startled. "That's a heart stimulant, is it not?" "In small doses," I said. "In larger ones, it stops the heart entirely, particularly in children." Holmes gave a grim nod. "Poison concealed within an instrument, delivered perhaps by touch or vapor. Ingenious, but only if no one thinks to listen for the rest of the song." He turned to us, eyes glittering. "This is no accident. It was staged, crafted with theatrical precision. A child made to appear fallen without cause. A note that ends too soon. And now..." A knock echoed through the nave below. We froze. Holmes extinguished the lantern. Footsteps sounded on the flagstone floor, soft, measured, deliberate. He gestured silently for us to remain hidden. We crept to the gallery's edge and peered down into the chapel. A figure stood near the altar, dressed in a dark coat and gloves, his features obscured by the shadows. He held something in his hand, a satchel. Holmes leaned closer, his whisper barely audible. "Let us see what brings Mr. Deeks back to the scene of his aria." The trap had begun to close. Holmes did not move for several seconds, his lean form frozen at the gallery's edge, watching the figure below. The man, presumably Lionel Deeks, moved with a careful deliberateness that spoke not of prayer or mourning, but of searching. He knelt by the altar rail, opened his satchel, and withdrew a slim bundle. Even from our distance, I could see him fumble nervously with its contents, loose sheets of music paper. A moment later, he tore several pages in half and stuffed them into the brass waste bin at the base of the altar. "Destruction of evidence," Holmes murmured beside me. "And past midnight, when only the guilty or the desperate stir." Deeks stood, adjusted his gloves, and turned as if to leave. Holmes moved like a panther. Before I could register it, we were descending the spiral stairs, our footfalls muffled by the stone. Holmes didn't pause as he threw open the chapel doors, stepping silently into the nave. "Good evening, Mr. Deeks," Holmes called. The man spun about, eyes wide in panic. He was in his late 30s, tall and pale-faced, with a sharp widow's peak and a pinched mouth that trembled at Holmes's greeting. For a second, he looked ready to flee. "Going somewhere?" Holmes continued, his tone smooth but heavy with implication. I didn't expect anyone here," Deeks stammered. "Who are you?" "I believe the Reverend Greaves introduced me earlier," Holmes said. "Sherlock Holmes, this is my colleague Dr. Watson." The organist's composure frayed visibly. "I was only returning to collect some of my papers." "Indeed? And were you planning to retrieve them from the bin?" Holmes gestured toward the crumpled remnants of sheet music still smoldering in the waste bin, a thin curl of smoke rising in the chapel's stale air. Deeks swallowed hard. They were drafts, nothing of consequence. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll have no objection to our examining them." Before Deeks could protest, Holmes crossed the nave, reached into the bin, and pulled out the singed edges of the music pages. They were still warm. He fanned them out and inspected them quickly. "Curious," he said, more to himself than to Deeks. "The same notation style as the unfinished hymn found in the boy's hand. The same irregular phrasing." "I don't know what you mean," Deeks said. His voice was becoming thinner, more brittle with every word. Holmes stepped forward until he stood mere feet from him. "You found the boy, did you not? Discovered him collapsed beside the organ?" Yes, At what time, precisely?" 7:15. I always arrive early on Thursdays." "Why?" Holmes asked. "Why Thursdays?" Deeks blinked. "For rehearsal." Holmes cocked his head. "But Greaves said your rehearsals were on Tuesdays and Saturdays." Deeks hesitated too long. "Let us dispense with pretense," Holmes said. "You were not here for rehearsal. You came to the chapel knowing the boy would be alone." "No, he wasn't meant to be there. I swear it." The words tumbled from Deeks now, hastily. "He must have returned for something, music or a book. I didn't see him arrive." "Yet you saw him die." Deeks stepped back, mouth twitching. I don't know what happened. He collapsed. I thought it was a fainting spell." Holmes gave him no reprieve. "So naturally you decided not to alert anyone until after the fact. Naturally you omitted the presence of blood. Naturally you failed to mention a hidden compartment in the piano, one which contained a vial of digitalis." Deeks looked stunned. What are you saying?" "That you knew what would happen," Holmes said. "You orchestrated it?" "No. You concealed the delivery method within the very instrument the boy revered. You expected the poison to leave no trace, no struggle, just a lifeless body and a mystery." "I didn't," Deeks began, then broke off. The silence that followed was long and suffocating. Watson took a step forward. "But why, Mr. Deeks? What could a boy have done to you that would provoke such a crime?" Deeks stared at the floor. "You don't understand," he said, voice low. "It wasn't supposed to be him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Ah, now we are getting somewhere." "I meant only to send a warning," Deeks said. "A demonstration. To the Reverend. To the trustees." Holmes's tone sharpened. "A warning, you say? What were you warning them about?" Deeks looked up, eyes feverish. "They were replacing me. After 6 years. They planned to bring in a new director, someone younger, a rising star from Oxford. I heard them speaking of it after Evensong's 2 weeks ago. And so you staged a murder." "I didn't mean for Peter to die," he burst out. "I was testing the mechanism. I never thought he would—" He broke off, covering his mouth. Holmes looked to me. "Watson, the piano's compartment. How might digitalis be deployed? On the keys, in an aerosol form." "It could be administered as a fine dust," I replied, "or applied to the keys with a solvent that evaporates. Touch would be enough." Holmes turned back to Deeks. "You believed only an adult would trigger it, someone with the authority to open the piano lid." "I never imagined the boy would—" His voice cracked. Holmes was silent for a long moment, then said, "You will write out your confession tonight. Then you will wait with the Reverend until Inspector Lestrade arrives by train tomorrow." Deeks said nothing. He slumped against the side of the pew, defeated. As Holmes turned and walked away, I followed him, the weight of the scene pressing upon us like the fog outside. We reached the rectory and found Reverend Greaves in the study, still awake, his expression grim. "Mr. Holmes?" Holmes handed him the crumpled remains of the sheet music and the monogrammed handkerchief. "The boy's death was no divine accident, Reverend. It was a calculated act, carried out by a man desperate to preserve his relevance. But in seeking to intimidate, he murdered." Greaves bowed his head. "I shall remain with Mr. Deeks until the authorities arrive." Holmes nodded. "Make no mention of the confession until it is written, and be careful what you touch." Later, in our room upstairs, I poured Holmes a brandy and watched as he sat at the window, eyes distant. "You knew early on," I said, "that Deeks was the culprit?" Holmes shook his head. "Not at first, but the unfinished hymn. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a rehearsal. The boy had seen something, Watson. Perhaps he watched Deeks working at the piano in secret. Perhaps he tried to recreate the melody he'd heard, a warning in his own way." He sighed, but his voice was silenced before the song could be completed. We sat in silence for a long time. Then Holmes, in a rare moment of reflection, said quietly, "It is a terrible thing when beauty is used to deliver death. But even more terrible is when a child is the one who pays the price." I nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the wind stirred through the chapel spires, and for a fleeting moment, I fancied I heard a single, pure soprano note echo through the stone. Unfinished, but heard. Dawn arrived with the low rumble of cart wheels and the faint tolling of the chapel bell. It rang slowly, a funeral cadence, though no service had been called. Reverend Greaves had asked for the bell to be tolled once, out of respect for the boy who would never sing again. The sound drifted through the frosted panes of our guest room in the rectory, where Holmes stood, already dressed, gazing through the warped glass. He had not slept, nor had I truly. The events of the night pressed heavily upon us both, though Holmes bore his weight in silence. He was troubled, though I could not at first say why. Deeks' confession had seemed complete, the case, at least on the surface, closed. Yet Holmes did not look satisfied. "I do not like it, Watson," he said finally, his voice low. "What is it you mistrust? The confession?" "No," he said, turning from the window. "That is real enough. What troubles me is that it came too easily." I frowned. "You forced it." He shook his head. "Number, he offered it. Under pressure, yes, but it was not extracted through revelation. Deeks was afraid, yes, but not of justice. He was afraid of something else, something left unsaid. Panic, perhaps. The guilt of unintended murder. Guilt does not compel a man to return to a chapel after midnight to burn papers. That is fear, Watson. And fear suggests that someone else holds a tighter leash than Scotland Yard." I sat forward. "You believe he was not acting alone?" "I believe," Holmes said, pulling on his gloves, "that we have not yet heard the final." Note: we met Lestrade at the station an hour later, the inspector stepping down from the early express in his usual brown coat and a look of dogged suspicion. Holmes greeted him with a firm handshake. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, I hear you've already solved the case without me." "We've solved a crime," Holmes said, "but not, I think, the mystery." Lestrade gave him a sideways look. "That sort of talk usually means we're about to trip over some complication. What have we got?" Holmes handed him the confession, which Lestrade skimmed with a grunt. "Poison in the piano, eh? Odd method, but tidy, I'll give him that. You've got motive, confession, and physical evidence. And still it stinks, Holmes said flatly. I want to see where Lionel Deeks lives. Lestrade blinked. His lodgings? What for? Because a man does not compose murder in a chapel. He prepares it somewhere quiet, alone or with encouragement. Lestrade, to his credit, did not argue further. He summoned the local constable, and within the hour we found ourselves outside a narrow flat above a cobbler's shop on the edge of the village green. The cobbler, an elderly man with a clouded eye, gave us a curious glance but said nothing as we climbed the outside stairs. Inside, Deeks's lodgings were spare and fastidiously neat. A bookshelf lined with musical theory, a metronome ticking in the corner. Holmes moved through the room with feline grace. Pausing at the desk, he opened a drawer and removed a sheaf of letters. Here, he said. Recent correspondence. Watson, note the handwriting. I did, and blinked in surprise. The curling script was identical to the hymn we had found clutched in the dead boy's hand. Deeks didn't write the music, I said aloud. Someone else did. Indeed, Holmes murmured, and that someone had access to his confidence, his resentment, and likely more. He passed the letter to Lestrade. It was signed only with an initial, M. Have you seen this initial before? Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded slowly. We are dealing with someone who uses intermediaries. Someone who composes plots the way others compose sonatas. From the pile of letters, Holmes selected one with a torn seal. You need only demonstrate weakness in the system. They will retreat, and you will remain indispensable. Let the instrument become the message. Music, after all, is memory. And silence can be even louder. Lestrade scratched his head. That's not the sort of thing someone writes in a friendly note. No, Holmes agreed. It is the kind of thing a puppeteer whispers from the wings. The revelation cast a new pall over the case. Deeks had not been alone. He had been manipulated, pushed to act by someone who understood not just his fear, but his pride, and the true author of the fatal hymn had never touched a piano. Holmes moved to the small writing desk in the corner and opened the lower drawer. Inside was a folder marked with a crest, the seal of the Royal Academy of Music. He pulled out a single application form and studied it. Then he turned to Lestrade. Did Reverend Greaves mention who was being considered to replace Deeks? Lestrade shook his head. Holmes handed him the form. The name filled the top line in that same elegant, curling hand. Michael Eastmore. Michael Eastmore, I said slowly. That's our M, and a rising name in the composition circles, Holmes added. Formerly a student at the Academy, now a lecturer. More importantly, someone who once wrote a paper on acoustic suggestions and the psychological manipulation of tone. I read it last year. It was rejected from the Harmonium Review for being too speculative. Now he's using that speculation to kill, I asked. To incite, Holmes said. Eastmore never laid a hand on Peter Willoughby, but he gave Deeks the idea, fed it, refined it, and let him carry it out. Lestrade folded his arms. That's all well and good, Mr. Holmes, but a letter and an application don't prove complicity. No, Holmes said softly, but I know where we might find the rest. We returned to the chapel just before midday. Holmes moved with purpose, heading not for the antechamber or the loft, but the crypt. The crypt? I asked. Eastmore knows this building well. He served as a visiting organist 2 years ago. And if he wanted a place to meet Deeks in secret, he trailed off as we descended the narrow stone stairs into the cold silence of the underground chamber. Rows of tombs lay beneath the chapel, ancient, sealed with time-darkened brass plates. Holmes's lantern illuminated a small alcove at the far end, where the smell of candle wax lingered faintly. There, nestled beside a disused altar, was a small folding chair, a stub of chalk on the floor, and a notebook, Holmes opened it. Inside were musical sketches, variations of the same theme that had ended Peter's song. Beneath one line were words scrawled in Latin, Finis coronat opus. The end crowns the work, Holmes translated. A composer's vanity. He saw this murder not as a crime, but as a performance. Lestrade stepped back. I'll have a warrant issued within the hour. Holmes nodded. See that it is done swiftly. Eastmore will flee the moment he hears Deeks has confessed. As we ascended back into the daylight, Holmes paused near the choir stalls. He looked up at the high stained glass windows, the light fractured into crimson and gold. I wonder, he said softly, how many heard that hymn and never knew they were listening to a requiem. You mean the congregation? I mean all of us, Watson. The choir boy died for a note he did not write, in a song meant to manipulate a man's ambition. There are few crimes more pitiful than when art is twisted into violence. I stood beside him, the cold fading as the sun finally touched the chapel's floor. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Holmes spent the remainder of that day in restless silence, pacing the perimeter of the chapel, fingers pressed to his lips, eyes far away. Lestrade, for his part, returned to the village constable's office to prepare the necessary warrants. It was agreed that Eastmore would be arrested in London, quietly, without fanfare, should he still be there. A wire had already been dispatched to Scotland Yard, with orders to locate and detain him upon Holmes's authority. But Holmes was not yet content to wait. Watson, he said as the sun dipped low behind the chapel tower, we must return to Baker Street tonight. There's something I wish to verify, something that's been gnawing at the edges of my certainty like a rat behind the wainscoting. And you suspect Eastmore will flee? I suspect Eastmore believes he's safe, Holmes replied. He acts from the shadows. He has not yet heard that Deeks has broken under the weight of his own remorse, which means we may still surprise him. Our return to London was swift. The final hour of the journey passed in darkness. Holmes, for once, seemed in no mood to read, smoke, or even pontificate. He sat motionless, coat wrapped tightly about him, his eyes fixed upon nothing. I had come to recognize this mood, a focused stillness, as if his mind were running ahead of the train, already reaching the parlors and pianofortes of London's musical circles. By the time we reached Baker Street, the lamps were lit and the fog lay thick along the cobbles. Holmes wasted no time in retrieving a thin dossier from a locked drawer in the sitting room. He flipped it open on the table, spreading out notes with the same careful precision I had seen him use when reassembling broken clues or loading his revolver. Michael Eastmore, he said. Age 34. Former chorister himself. Winchester Cathedral. Educated at Oxford. Composed several pieces for string quartet, none of which were performed. Published theoretical work on auditory influence and tonal manipulation. But it is this, he said, pulling free a page, that I find particularly suggestive. It was a clipping from the Musical Gazette, dated 2 years prior, a scathing review of a performance at Queen's Hall. Eastmore's latest composition, though intellectually ambitious, lacks warmth and coherence. Its obsession with unresolved harmonic tension borders on the pathological. Rejected by the Academy. Mocked by critics, Holmes said. But note the venue, Queen's Hall, the very hall where young Peter Willoughby was scheduled to perform next month. Eastmore's replacement of Deeks would have placed him directly in the boy's path. I considered this. So you believe Peter recognized the melody, something Eastmore composed privately, and attempted to recreate it? Or Eastmore had rehearsed it under the guise of instruction, Holmes replied. Either way, the boy recorded it, a musical fragment that tied Eastmore to the crime. And that fragment cost him his life. Holmes nodded grimly. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Lestrade. We've found him, he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. Eastmore has a studio flat in Bloomsbury, under a different name, Miles Everett. One of our men noticed the signature on the lease matched that of the academy application. Clever, but not clever enough. He hasn't left yet. Holmes's expression sharpened. Then we must act. Lestrade gestured to the waiting cab outside. I thought you might say that. It was a short ride to Bloomsbury, and we arrived at a quiet row of brick buildings nestled between a bookseller and a tea merchant. Lestrade led us to the third floor, where a flickering gaslight illuminated a faded door marked with a brass number and no name. He knocked firmly. There was a pause. Then the door opened, just a crack. Michael Eastmore was smaller than I expected. Slender, with a pale, narrow face and an angular jaw that looked as though it had been drawn with a compass. His hair was neatly combed and a smudge of ink lingered on the edge of one finger. His voice, when he spoke, was even and cool. Yes? Mr. Eastmore, also known as Miles Everett? Lestrade asked. Eastmore's eyes barely flicked. I am he. I'm Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. These are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your correspondence with a Mr. Lionel Deeks Eastmore's eyes shifted toward Holmes, who said nothing. The silence stretched. What of it? Eastmore said finally. You were advising him on musical matters, were you not? Eastmore's mouth curved into a faint smile. He consulted me, yes. Poor man. Quite insecure. He feared his tenure at St. Anselm's was nearing its end. And you encouraged him to preserve his position? Holmes said mildly. I gave him perspective, Eastmore said. I merely suggested that he remind his employers of his value, which he apparently took to absurd extremes. Absurd indeed, Lestrade said, particularly as a boy is now dead. Eastmore's expression remained unchanged. That is tragic, but I had no part in it. Holmes stepped forward. You wrote the unfinished hymn, he said. I write many things. You coached Deeks into constructing a deadly demonstration. I advised him to assert himself. You lured him with your theories. Your vanity masked as instruction. You may not have administered the poison, but you orchestrated the act. A murder through manipulation. Eastmore's smile grew thin. I gave him music. If he chose to interpret it as a weapon, that is his failing, not mine. Holmes's voice dropped a degree. Then why destroy the notebook in the chapel crypt? This time the flicker was real. Eastmore's eyes tightened. What notebook? The one in which you sketched every dissonant variation. Finis coronat opus. The end crowns the work. For the first time, Eastmore looked uncertain. Holmes continued, relentless. You imagined it as a performance, your theory and practice. You played Deeks like a violin, and now he has confessed. Eastmore stepped back. This is preposterous. None of this proves anything. Your handwriting, Holmes said, matches the music found in the boy's hand. We have letters, applications, journal drafts. The match will be confirmed before morning. Lestrade stepped forward, producing a set of manacles. Michael Eastmore, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Eastmore stood very still. Then quietly he asked, Will the court understand the difference between a composer and an instrument? You'll have time to ponder that, Lestrade said grimly. Holmes said nothing more until we were back in the cab. Then, as the lights of Bloomsbury receded, he turned to me. He tried to make art from silence, he said. But even silence has authorship. And justice? I asked. Holmes looked out the window. Justice has a rhythm of its own, sometimes quiet, but never still. The trial of Michael Eastmore did not take long to capture the public imagination. The press dubbed him the composer of death, and broadsheets soon overflowed with lurid headlines that blurred the boundary between fact and spectacle. One could scarcely turn a corner in Fleet Street without seeing his gaunt likeness rendered in charcoal, or hearing whispered speculations in the coffee houses about whether a man could truly commit murder without lifting a finger. Holmes, of course, had no interest in the newspaper frenzy. He withdrew from the affair as soon as Eastmore had been charged. Once the mechanisms of justice had begun to grind, he turned his attention to other cases with typical detachment, at least outwardly. But I knew him too well not to notice the lingering thread of thought, the fragment of melody that kept looping through his mind. He had taken to sitting at the window again, gazing down at Baker Street with that same expression I had seen after we first discovered Peter Willoughby's lifeless form beside the chapel organ. That case had struck something deeper in him. Not sorrow, precisely. Holmes was not given to conventional grief, but a kind of moral irritation, as though someone had used the tools of art in service of rot. One evening, some weeks after Eastmore's arrest, I found Holmes at the fireplace, rereading the coroner's report by lamplight. The spring rain tapped against the window pane, soft and insistent. I had hoped he had laid the matter to rest. But the sheet of music, the boy's final note, still lay unfolded beside him. "You still suspect there's more," I said gently. He looked up, blinking once, then turned his gaze to the fire. "I am no longer certain of anything," he said quietly. "And that, Watson, is a discomfort I do not wear well." I took my seat opposite him, noting the weariness in his eyes, not physical fatigue, but the burden of some unresolved dissonance. "Then tell me what troubles you," I said. "From the beginning." Holmes tapped his fingers on the armrest, slowly, deliberately. "It is the confession. Deeks gave us everything, too easily. His remorse was genuine, yes, but his statements about Eastmore were conveniently vague. And Eastmore, clever though he was, did not attempt to cover his trail beyond the crypt. A man of his intellect would have predicted the discovery of his letters, his fingerprints on the manuscript. His entire design was theatrical, almost self-incriminating. I frowned. "You think he wanted to be caught?" Holmes shook his head. I think he believed someone else would shield him." The thought landed between us with quiet weight. "Greaves," I said slowly. "The Reverend." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "There are details that have returned to me. Tiny fractures. When Greaves first arrived at Baker Street, he claimed the hymn found in Peter's hand was one he did not recognize. And yet when we examined the manuscript later, I found it curious how easily he recalled the stylistic tendencies. "Not something the boy could have composed," he said. "An educated guess," I offered. "Or an intimate familiarity with the author." I leaned forward. "You think Greaves was part of it?" "I think Greaves may have known more than he admitted. Consider his position, master of music at the chapel, deeply invested in its reputation. He stood to lose prestige if Deeks was dismissed or replaced under scandalous terms. He knew Eastmore, having invited him previously as a visiting organist. Perhaps he even admired him. And perhaps, I said, he turned a blind eye when Eastmore's suggestions veered into the dangerous. Holmes nodded. Or worse, he sanctioned the experiment. A chill passed through me. It was one thing to imagine a composer twisting art into a weapon, but for a clergyman, a teacher of children, to quietly abet such manipulation, it turned the affair from tragedy to betrayal. "Do we confront him?" I asked. Not yet. We observe." And so the next morning we boarded the train once again for Hampshire. The journey passed in taut silence, both of us immersed in private thought. Holmes had sent no telegram ahead. He wished to arrive unannounced. St. Anselm's looked much as we had left it, though perhaps a touch more solemn. A wreath now hung outside the chapel door, and the pews inside bore pale spring flowers. Peter's memory had been given its due, but the lingering note of unease had not dissipated. Reverend Greaves received us in his study, surprised but not displeased. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. How unexpected. I had thought you'd moved on from this wretched affair." "We hoped to," Holmes said smoothly. But a question arose in the aftermath. Greaves folded his hands. Of course. What question? Holmes's tone remained polite. Do you remember your first meeting with Mr. Eastmore? Greaves blinked. Yes, some years ago. He gave a guest recital at the Academy while I was attending a conference. You invited him to St. Anselm's? I did. He performed twice, once at evensong and once at a spring service. Did he compose anything for the chapel during that time? A few minor pieces. Nothing significant. Holmes paused. Would you mind showing me the register of visitors and music programs from that year? Greaves hesitated. Only briefly, but Holmes saw it. I'm afraid those records are currently being reviewed, he said. Holmes's gaze darkened. By whom? Our lay committee. The trustees requested a review of all historical music selections following the incident. It's merely a precaution. Holmes said nothing. He rose, walked to the bookshelves and trailed his fingers along the spines. What a fine library, he murmured. May I? He removed a bound volume, a collection of seasonal service programs. Greaves moved as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Holmes opened the book to a random page, a list of hymns, notations, and composers. There, 3 pages in, was the phrase we had seen before, Finis coronat opus. Holmes looked up. This hymn, this phrase, it appeared in your Easter program 2 years ago. Greaves paled. You knew the theme. You had heard it before. You recognized it the moment you saw it in Peter's hand. Greaves stood. Mr. Holmes, You knew Eastmore's capabilities. You invited him back. You allowed him proximity to Deeks. You gave him influence. Greaves's mouth opened, but no words came. You didn't plot the murder, Holmes said coldly, but you tolerated the conditions that made it possible. You let Eastmore test his theories under your roof, and when a boy died, you withheld your knowledge. I didn't know he would go that far, Greaves whispered. But you knew he might, Holmes snapped, and you did nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Holmes stepped back, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. I am not the law, Reverend, but I will see to it that those who are informed receive the truth. Greaves sank into his chair, the weight of consequence crashing down like the bell that had tolled for Peter. We left him there in his study, surrounded by programs, hymnals, and the echo of a choice he could not undo. Outside, the sky had turned from grey to gold. Will you have him prosecuted? I asked as we crossed the chapel green. No, Holmes said quietly. His guilt will not be measured in courtrooms. And then, with a distant look in his eyes, he added, but neither will it ever leave him. The journey back to London was sombre. Holmes said little, retreating into that impenetrable silence of his that I had come to associate with moral unease. Not frustration, nor professional dissatisfaction, but the quiet bitterness he reserved for those crimes that struck at innocence under the veil of civility. There had been no violence in Reverend Greaves's actions, but in some ways his passive complicity had affected Holmes more deeply than Eastmore's calculated manipulations. Men like Eastmore, he said finally, as the train shuddered across the countryside, see the world as a stage. But men like Greaves, well, Watson, they are the curtain. They hide the act, lend it dignity, then feign shock when the audience is horrified. You believe he will resign. I believe, Holmes replied, that he no longer has a place in that chapel, whether he realizes it yet or not. Back in Baker Street, Holmes returned the case files to their shelf with an air of finality. The sheet music, the fatal fragment, he folded carefully and placed into an envelope marked in his own hand. St. Anselm's, Willoughby case. Then he tucked it into his drawer, closed it with a soft click, and locked it. The matter, I assumed, was closed. But fate is rarely so tidy. It was 2 days later, while we were dining on cold fowl and pickled onions, that a visitor arrived. Mrs. Hudson handed me the calling card, while Holmes remained seated, absently stirring mustard into his brandy. The card read, "Edwin Willoughby, solicitor, Westwood and Pryor, father of Peter Willoughby." I glanced up in surprise. Holmes had already extended a hand toward the door. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." Edwin Willoughby was a man of modest stature, with a face made more haggard by recent grief. He was dressed plainly but with precision, the kind of man who knew how to appear composed even as his heart was breaking. When he removed his hat, the look he gave Holmes was not one of blame, but of resolve. "I understand you uncovered the man responsible for my son's death," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "Two men, in truth, one who poisoned and another who encouraged the act through intellectual vanity." "And the churchman?" Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. He shielded the knowledge. Whether through loyalty or cowardice, I cannot say. Willoughby gave a dry nod. "That sounds like Saint Anselm's." He sat uninvited and placed a worn leather folder on the table. "I've come not for vengeance, Mr. Holmes. I've come because I believe Peter left something behind, something more than just that fragment of music." Holmes leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Willoughby opened the folder and drew out several pages of lined paper. School composition sheets, each one covered in handwriting. "Peter kept a notebook," he said. "He called it his secret music diary. He never let us read it while he was alive, but after his death I couldn't help myself. Most of it is what you'd expect. Notes on pieces he liked, melodies he was working on, even drawings of the chapel choir stalls." He flipped to a page halfway through. "But then there's this." Holmes and I leaned in. In a child's careful but uneven hand was written, "Mr. D is talking to the man with the sharp eyes again. They keep whispering in the crypt. I heard them say test and demonstrate. I think it's about the piano. I don't like it." Mr. D looked scared, and beneath it, in a different entry, the melody he played again today had the wrong ending. It felt bad. It sounded like falling off the edge of a roof. I wrote down what I could remember, but it makes me feel cold. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up at Willoughby. "Your son saw more than anyone realized." Willoughby nodded, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of pride in his grief. He was clever, quiet, but observant. Holmes handled the pages with care. "This will close the gap in the record." The boy knew, perhaps not exactly what was intended, but he sensed danger. That melody may have been his way of warning someone. "I thought," Willoughby said slowly, "that you might know what to do with this. I don't want it to rot in some police file or be fed to the courts for drama. I want it understood." Holmes gave a rare, soft nod. "It will be." After Willoughby departed, we sat for a time in silence. Holmes lit his pipe and stared at the fire, the boy's words still resting on the table between us. "Watson," he said eventually, "it is a rare thing for truth to arrive unadorned. Most of the time, we must dig for it, peel away lies, distraction, even our own assumptions. But sometimes it arrives in a child's hand, written without flourish, without agenda." He tapped the ash from his pipe. "Peter Willoughby became the first true witness of his own murder, and he left behind the testimony." I felt a knot tighten in my throat. Later that evening, Holmes penned a letter to the Crown Prosecution Service, enclosing copies of the diary entries, noting that Peter had accurately described Eastmore's conversations prior to the crime. Though not admissible as legal evidence in the strictest sense, Holmes knew that public and institutional pressure could ensure Eastmore's conviction would not falter under some legal technicality. Before sealing the envelope, Holmes paused. Then, with meticulous care, he added a note in his own script. It is rare that a victim writes part of his own verdict. May it be read as solemnly as any confession, and with greater honor than any defense." He sealed the envelope. The trial came 6 weeks later. Eastmore, when confronted with Peter's diary, had nothing more to say. No clever epigrams, no intellectual abstractions. His defense fell silent. The jury found him guilty in less than a day. Life imprisonment followed, and I doubt the world of music ever heard his name again, except in legal records and the hushed retellings of choir school corridors. As for Reverend Greaves, he quietly resigned from St. Anselm's. No charges were brought against him, but his departure was not gentle. It was, as Holmes predicted, self-imposed exile cloaked in humility. Peter Willoughby was remembered in a memorial service attended by more than 300. His unfinished hymn was played, completed by his classmates in solemn tribute. Holmes did not attend, though I suspect he would have, had he known what to do with grief in public. But later, at home, I heard him humming the completed melody to himself, a rare, fragile moment of reverence. On the last page of Peter's notebook, beneath his final entry, were 4 simple words. Someone will hear this. And someone had. The summer that followed was gentle, as if the world itself sought to soften the memory of winter's loss. The fog lifted from Baker Street, and with it some small part of the shadow that had hung over our sitting room since the Willoughby case had begun. And yet the absence of pressing cases left Holmes in a curious state of agitation, restless, unsatisfied. It was during one such idle afternoon, while Holmes was pretending to be interested in a monograph on parasitic beetles, that I received a letter. Not from Scotland Yard, nor from any of our usual associates, but from a familiar hand all the same. Edwin Willoughby. I read it aloud. "My dear Dr. Watson, I hope this finds you and Mr. Holmes well. I write not to burden you with more sorrow, but to thank you for your part in uncovering the truth. As you know, Peter's unfinished melody was performed at his memorial, completed by his peers as best they could imagine he might have wished it. A curious thing happened that day. The Bishop of Winchester was in attendance, as was a representative from the Royal Academy. After the performance, several choir masters approached me, each moved not just by the piece, but by Peter's careful documentation in his diary. One asked if the pages might be published, not as legal evidence, but as a memorial, a testimony in his own voice. I have consented. A limited edition will be printed and given to schools and chapels throughout the region. Peter's melody will become part of an annual concert to commemorate young musicians lost too soon. I thought Mr. Holmes might find some satisfaction in that. Yours in gratitude, Edwin Willoughby." I folded the letter gently. Holmes said nothing at first, but I could see the tautness in his jaw had eased. He closed the monograph and stared into the middle distance. "It is something, Watson," he said at last. "Not justice, perhaps, in the full sense, but something close to what justice sounds like." A moment later he rose, crossed to the bureau and retrieved the envelope he had sealed weeks earlier, the one labeled St. Anselm's, Willoughby case. He opened it, drew out the sheet of music, and held it to the light. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the nature of unfinished things. Most men cannot bear them. A story without resolution, a puzzle without a solution. But I wonder, does everything require an ending? Or is it enough, sometimes, to be heard?" I didn't answer. I knew Holmes wasn't truly asking. A fortnight passed before the next thread revealed itself. It arrived not by telegram or visitor, but through Lestrade, who stopped by in a rare state of pique. "I'll never get used to it," he muttered, pacing before our fireplace. "How even when I think a case is tied up neatly, one of your blasted footprints turns up leading off in a new direction." Holmes arched a brow. "Are you here with a compliment, Lestrade, or a complaint?" "Both," he grumbled, before pulling out a thin file. You recall the music school Eastmore was scheduled to join? The replacement position Deeks was so afraid of losing? The Royal School of Harmonic Science, Holmes said. A pompous title, if ever there was one. Well, I paid them a visit, Lestrade continued. Routine follow-up. But I learned something curious. Eastmore had been corresponding with a financier, one Lord Albert Waylake. Now, that's not strange in itself, but Waylake's name came up recently in a fraud investigation. Holmes's interest sharpened. Fraud involving what? Donations to educational institutions, Lestrade said. Specifically, funds intended for choir schools and musical societies. Turns out Eastmore was to be the academic lead on a project to reorganize a number of chapel music departments. St. Anselm's was to be the first. Deeks was to be removed, shall we say. By pressure or poison? Holmes asked dryly. Lestrade ignored him. Here's where it gets interesting. The so-called pilot program was to begin this spring, with Waylake funding the restructuring and Eastmore guiding the curriculum. But the money never arrived. Waylake vanished before the transfer, and Eastmore's files, well, half of them are missing. Holmes stood slowly. So, the death of a choir boy wasn't merely a madman's experiment. It was the opening act in a plan involving money, institutional control, and reputation. Lestrade nodded. Eastmore may have started with ideology, but he was heading towards something more lucrative. And Greaves? Still missing from the narrative, Lestrade said. But his resignation came just days after Waylake disappeared. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? More than curious, Holmes murmured. It suggests Greaves was never just shielding Eastmore. He may have been trying to shield himself from what he suspected would come next. Holmes paced slowly. Watson, do you recall Greaves's reluctance to show us the visitor's log? Of course. You thought he had something to hide. What if what he was hiding wasn't just Eastmore, but Waylake himself? I blinked. You think the financier visited the chapel? It would explain the sudden appearance of a restructuring plan and Greaves's discomfort when pressed. He knew the chapel was a pawn in something larger, an operation that combined music, money, and manipulation. Lestrade crossed his arms. Waylake has property in Dorset. That's where the last wire was traced, before he vanished. I can send men to the estate. Holmes shook his head. Number, let Watson and me go. This case began in song and silence. I'd like to hear how it ends. Waylake's Dorset estate lay crumbling on the edge of a moor. When we arrived 2 days later, it was clear no repairs had been undertaken in years. Ivy strangled the garden walls, and a half-collapsed conservatory jutted out like a fractured wing. The butler, an aging man with a milky eye, admitted us with minimal protest. His lordship is indisposed, he murmured. Holmes offered no name, no warrant. He simply walked inside. Lord Albert Waylake sat in a study filled with antique instruments and unopened letters. His face was thin, pallid. Not the look of a man hiding, but of one who had waited too long for the door to be kicked in. I was wondering how long it would take you, he said without rising. You backed Eastmore, Holmes said, and when he was arrested, you vanished. I withdrew. Waylake corrected. There is a difference. I saw a poor investment. Holmes's voice hardened. You saw a dead child, you saw scandal, and you fled. Waylake gave a weak smile. I didn't poison the boy. Number, but you created the conditions in which he could be poisoned. You funded a system that rewarded arrogance and called it reform, and when your prize academic lost his footing, you tried to cut the thread before it snapped. Silence. Then Waylake said quietly, What is it you want, Mr. Holmes? Holmes's gaze was ice. Nothing from you. You will answer to Parliament, to the Church, and to the families you defrauded. But not to me. He turned and left the room without another word. As we crossed the lawn to the cab, I said, "That's it then." Holmes nodded. No more echoes. No more unfinished notes. And in the distance, the wind passed through the crumbling conservatory windows. Not with a song, but with silence. London, for all its chaos and clamour, has a curious way of returning to equilibrium. The headlines that once blared, "Death in the Choir, Boy's Last Note Reveals Killer," had given way to other scandals, other distractions. A diplomat's mistress had vanished in Kensington. A fire in the Strand had consumed an entire theatre. The world moved on. But Holmes did not. It was late August, and the shadows were lengthening in Baker Street. I found him one evening leaning over his chemistry bench, not experimenting, but simply staring. A single Bunsen burner flickered beneath a beaker of untouched water. Beside it sat Peter Willoughby's completed sheet music, now laminated between glass and backing board, a gift from Edwin Willoughby, accompanied by a note, "For the one who heard it first." "You never framed anything before," I said gently, pouring us both a brandy. Holmes didn't look up. "I didn't do it for sentiment, Watson." "Of course not." He allowed a small, wry smile. "I did it," he continued, "because it is evidence, not of a crime, but of something finer that was lost. The boy's instincts were keener than most adults. He knew what the melody meant, even if he could not explain it." I raised my glass. "To the choir boy who solved his own murder." Holmes did not raise his. Instead, he stepped away from the workbench and moved to the window, where the setting sun burned low over the rooftops of Marylebone. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "how many such songs go unheard?" I joined him in silence. The arrest of Lord Waylake had sparked its own chain reaction. A formal inquiry was underway, Parliament sniffing scandal in the arts, clergy distancing themselves from reformist zealots. Eastmore's association with Waylake had tainted a dozen promising initiatives, and with Greaves's resignation, St. Anselm's had become a cautionary tale whispered in vestries and choir school common rooms. But even as the official inquiries trudged forward, a new wrinkle arrived one September morning in the form of a telegram. To Sherlock Holmes. 221B Baker Street, from Inspector Lestrade. Scotland Yard, urgent development. Case requires re-examination. Please attend Newgate Prison immediately. Lestrade Holmes said nothing as he read it. He merely reached for his coat. We were admitted to Newgate through the usual formalities. The prison warden led us down a corridor whose walls dripped with condensation, the air thick with iron and damp. We found Lestrade waiting in a stone-walled holding chamber, looking unusually pale. "Holmes," he said, "I've just come from Eastmore's cell." "And?" "He's dead." Holmes froze. "How?" Lestrade handed him a small file. "Slashed his own wrists with a sharpened spoon, sometime in the night, but before that, he left this." He passed over a folded note. Holmes read it in silence, his face unreadable. Then he passed it to me. "To the machine of justice, I have played my final piece. But know this, the melody was not mine alone. The first bars came from another, one who still hides behind incense and stained glass, one who taught me not only how to compose, but how to conceal. I followed his rhythm. He wrote the rest. Let the choir finish the chorus." "M.E." I looked up sharply. "He means Greaves." Holmes said nothing, but I could see the truth in his eyes. Lestrade sat heavily. "We missed something, Holmes. We thought Greaves was merely complicit, passive. But this suggests otherwise." Holmes's voice was quiet. "It suggests Greaves was the architect." We left Newgate in silence. The journey back to Hampshire felt colder, though the sun still warmed the fields. Holmes was unusually tense, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed. I knew better than to speak. His mind was returning to every moment, every expression Greaves had worn, every pause in speech, every evasion. Re-evaluating. We arrived at St. Anselm's unannounced once more. The chapel grounds looked tidier than before. A new rector had taken over, and workmen were repainting the choir stalls. But Greaves was still in the village. He had not returned to his post, but had taken up temporary residence in a cottage near the churchyard, ostensibly to assist with the transition. Holmes knocked once. Greaves answered in shirt sleeves, his face pale and drawn. I saw in an instant that he had read the morning papers. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "I expected you. Did you expect me before or after the body was discovered?" Greaves didn't respond. He stepped aside, allowing us in. The sitting room was modest and yet lined with familiar things: music texts, old choir rosters, a cracked photograph of a younger Greaves seated at an organ bench beside a boy with thick spectacles. The air smelled of old candle wax and something faintly medicinal. "I'm tired of it, Holmes," Greaves said, sitting wearily. The whispers, the guilt, the silences. Holmes remained standing. "You didn't just shield Eastmore," he said. "You trained him, fed him your cynicism, showed him how to speak in riddles and hide meanings in music. You found in him the ambition you no longer dare to act on." Greaves said nothing. Holmes pressed forward. "You wanted to reshape the musical structure of England's churches, to move them out of stagnant tradition, as you called it once in a lecture. But no one would listen to you. They dismissed your ideas. They dismissed the need," Greaves said bitterly. "Congregations dwindled. Choirs lost funding. No one would act. So you sent Eastmore to do what you could not," Holmes said. "To provoke fear, to create a crisis that demanded reform." Greaves gave a hollow smile. "And it worked, didn't it? Now every chapel board in England is re-evaluating their practices. They will modernize, not out of desire, but necessity." Holmes's voice was cold. "You call that victory? A child is dead." Greaves closed his eyes. "I didn't mean for the boy to die." "You may not have slit his throat," Holmes said sharply, "but you laid out the blade. You designed the symphony. Eastmore was only your conductor." Silence fell. Greaves looked down at his hands. "Will you turn me in?" Holmes turned away. "Number Y will do worse. I will make sure you are remembered, not as a reformer, but as the man who let a boy sing his own requiem." He moved toward the door. "Leave Hampshire," Holmes said. "Leave the church, and do not think to re-enter the world of education." He paused. "Because I will be listening." We stepped into the sunlight once more, the birds singing overhead, the chapel bells ringing distant and clear. "You believe he'll obey?" I asked as we walked. "Yes," Holmes said, "because men like Greaves don't fear prison, they fear obscurity, and now that is what he shall have." We reached the lane that led back to the station. The path was quiet, except for the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet. "Holmes," I said after some time, "do you think Peter knew Greaves was behind it all?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "Peter knew the difference between truth and performance. And when the final note came, he sang only what was honest. That is more than any of them did. And as we turned the bend, I fancied I heard a faint echo of music, unfinished no longer." The year turned quietly after that, like the last movement of a sonata fading into silence. Autumn gave way to winter, and with it came the soft greys and silvers of London in hibernation. Fog rolling down Baker Street like a slow tide, the scent of coal fires thick in the air. Life resumed its rhythm, the clatter of hansom cabs, the snap of headlines, the ceaseless hum of a city too large to pause for any one tragedy. But at 221B, Something had changed. Holmes no longer spent his days in restless idleness between cases. He took fewer commissions, refused several of particular grandeur, and even turned down an invitation to lecture at the University of Vienna on the psychological dimensions of crime. I asked him once why. "The world is not short on murderers, Watson," he said, "but it is starved for those who remember why it matters." He turned then toward the framed sheet music that still hung on the wall above the fireplace. Peter Willoughby's melody, painstakingly completed by his friends, but with a red line drawn beneath the original measures. Holmes had added it himself. A quiet distinction. The voice that mattered most. And then, one crisp morning in November, a small package arrived. No return address, no wax seal. Just a simple envelope, worn at the corners, as if it had traveled far before finding its way to us. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a folded concert program. He handed them to me without a word. I read aloud, "Dear Mr. Holmes, you do not know me, but I knew Peter. I was one of the tenors at St. Anselm's. I wanted to tell you that tonight we are performing a concert in his memory, not just at the chapel, but at 7 different schools across England. Some of us helped arrange the pieces. Others simply came to sing. No one speaks about what happened anymore, not officially, but we all remember. Every time we see a new child sit in Peter's place, we've started calling the melody the Willoughby motif. It's not just the tune, it's the moment in the music where the harmony shifts, as if something unseen is passing by. Thank you for listening to him when the rest of us didn't know how. Sincerely, Alistair Franks Senior Chorister, now at Winchester College." I looked up. Holmes had returned to his violin. He was not playing anything recognizable, just letting the bow glide slowly across the strings, drawing out long, wandering tones that never quite resolved into melody. He had often said the violin was his method of thought, but today it sounded more like mourning. "I did not expect such a note," I said. "I did," he replied without looking up. "Children remember far longer than adults assume. The world gives them few tools to express what they know, but when it finds them, a pen, a diary, a song, they use them with more honesty than we do." He paused, lowered the violin. "That is why Greaves failed. That is why Eastmore crumbled. They mistook youth for ignorance. But Peter was never ignorant. He was watching, and he understood something was wrong. Long before any of us listened." I nodded. "And now they sing for him." Holmes rose and moved to the mantel. He adjusted the sheet music slightly, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the glass. "Watson, do you recall what Peter wrote at the end of his diary?" I did. I could see it in my mind even now, in that uneven but steady script. "Someone will hear this." Holmes tapped the frame once, gently. And someone did. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her eyebrows raised. "It's from Mr. Willoughby," she said. "He asks if you and Dr. Watson might attend the evening's performance at the Royal College of Music. Reserved seats, front row." Holmes took the telegram, read it, and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Will you go?" I asked. He looked at me, not with his usual detachment, but with something close to reluctance. "I do not attend performances often," he said. "Not when the conductor is grief." I understood. "And yet, but this time," I said, "you're not there for the music. You're there because someone trusted you to listen." Holmes considered that for a moment, and then he reached for his coat. The Royal College was filled to the rafters. No dignitaries, no reporters, just family members, students, and a scattering of musicians who understood what this concert was. Not a spectacle, but a promise kept. We were shown to our seats by a boy no older than Peter had been. He smiled nervously and whispered, "Thank you for coming, sir," before retreating to his post. The program was simple, a series of choral arrangements, some drawn from Peter's notebook, others composed in tribute. The final piece, the Willoughby motif, was listed with no composer credited, only a subtitle, "For the One Who Tried." To finish the song, the conductor raised his baton. And then it began. I will not attempt to describe it in technical terms. I lack the vocabulary of a musician. But I can tell you this. It began as Peter wrote it, the hesitant, uncertain line that wound its way into something luminous. At its center, a sudden shift, 3 notes, dissonant, like a cry in a cathedral. Then the pause, then harmony. Not resolution, not closure, but something close enough that the breath caught in my throat. Holmes sat unmoving beside me, his eyes closed. And when the final note faded, there was no applause for several seconds, only silence. Then, quietly, as if not to disturb the memory, those seated rose to their feet, not to cheer, but to honor. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Edwin Willoughby found us by the exit. "I didn't expect you to come," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "I don't often attend concerts," Holmes replied. "But tonight I wasn't listening to music. I was listening to a voice." Willoughby nodded. He would have liked that. He held out a folded card. "We're having a small plaque added to the chapel," he said. "It will say only this. He sang what he knew. No dates, no tragedy, just truth." Holmes took the card, and for once said nothing. Outside, the evening air had grown crisp. The streets of London pulsed with their usual life, but Holmes walked slowly, his gaze drifting toward the stars above. "Watson," he said as we turned onto Baker Street, "we have solved many murders, but this was the first time the victim solved it with us." "Yes," I said, "and in doing so, perhaps he saved others." Holmes gave a faint nod. Then he reached our doorstep, paused, and looked up once more at the sky, so filled with the vast hush of night, and softly, as if to himself, he whispered, "Finis coronet opus." It was several weeks after the memorial concert when the last piece of the puzzle arrived, not as a telegram or newspaper report, but as a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It bore no return address, only our own written in fine, deliberate ink. Mrs. Hudson had found it on the doorstep in the early hours, with no sign of who had left it. Holmes eyed the package carefully before slicing through the string with a penknife. Inside was a velvet pouch, and within it a silver locket. Holmes held it up to the light. It was a plain piece of jewelry, worn at the hinges, but engraved on its back were the initials P.W. He opened it. Inside was a tiny scrap of manuscript, a single bar of music, different from the rest, not part of Peter's last hymn, something separate. Folded behind it, almost hidden, was a second note, written in Reverend Greaves's hand. There is always one note, too many in every lie. Holmes stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. It was not a smile of victory, nor of pleasure, but of something rarer, understanding. "The final confession," he murmured. "Greaves?" I asked. "He's admitting guilt." "No," Holmes said. "He's admitting the truth." He rose and crossed to the framed music on the wall. With delicate fingers, he removed it from its place and flipped it open. Then he laid the bar from the locket beside it. The melody was identical until the final note. Peter's original version ended abruptly, dissonantly. The revised version, the one played at the concert, added a single resolving chord. But this new bar, the one tucked in the locket, was Peter's true final version. Not abrupt, not fully resolved either. A minor key shift that ended on an open fifth. Unfinished, yes, but intentional. "He changed it," Holmes said. "Peter modified the melody after transcribing what he'd heard from Eastmoor. This was his true voice, still uncertain, still haunted, but not broken, and Greaves knew it." He turned to me. This was Greaves' way of making amends, not to the courts, not to the church, but to the boy. He preserved Peter's final revision, hid it, protected it, and when all the noise faded, he gave it back. Then why not reveal it earlier? Because he still believed the lie he told himself, that he hadn't caused the death. It took Eastmore's suicide, the public reckoning, and the memorial to break through the pride. Only when the world stopped listening to him did he finally hear Peter. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. So that's the end of it? Holmes nodded, his gaze lingering on the locket. Yes, that is the last note. He replaced the framed music with the newly revealed bar now preserved alongside it. Then he stepped back and regarded it in full. Watson, he said softly, most men leave behind possessions, estates, names, scandals. Peter Willoughby left behind something greater. He left behind a question and the courage to ask it. I watched as Holmes moved to his desk and, for the first time in months, opened his journal. With a flourish of ink, he penned a final entry beneath the case heading, the case of the final note of the choirboy, concluded, with the truth restored not by deduction alone, but by a child's courage and a man's late repentance. Then, closing the book, Holmes set down his pen. Outside, the bells of Westminster rang the hour. The sound drifted across the rooftops of London like the lingering echo of a remembered voice, a voice that had once sung from the back of a chapel, and now, at last, had been heard.